Welcome back to the Commodore's table, me hearty, and let's talk about the 5 things that make dungeon masters terrible. But before we do, join the crew. Make sure you're subscribed. Let's raise the black flag. Bad game mastering and story habits. I want to talk about this because this happens all over in gaming, and it's unfortunate because a lot of it can be due to lack of experience game mastering. A lot of it can be due to lack of understanding how to tell a good story. And some of it can be ego. So these are the things you got to be careful with when you're playing with different groups. So let's start on my number 1 thing. So the first point that I think really causes problems for groups and for GMs is ego. Letting your ego get in the way and saying that, you know, it's something's an attack on you. Well, what that can do is it causes storytellers and game masters to take it out on the player. That's totally unfair. Now, sometimes a character does something stupid and a player plays their character unintelligently. They do something ridiculous and they fail. And at that point, it's okay to treat them a little less fairly because obviously they did something, you know, as long as it's within the realm of the game and understanding that it's within the realm of this character and what happened to this character happened because of the player's input, that's justifiable. However, when you have a story element and you bypass that, the players bypass your story element and you get upset about it because you spent a lot of time on it and now you have to come up with something new on the fly, you know, taking it out on the player who instigated that, that's not okay. And this is why this is bad. Because players start to think you're treating them unfairly. Now, I had this happen in a game where I was not going along with what my game master wanted, and he started getting upset about it. So I critically failed an attack, and then he said, well, make an attack roll against yourself. And I critically hit on myself. And he said, okay, make another roll. And I rolled another 20. So a 1 followed by 2 20s in a row. And he goes, well, your character cuts his leg off. And I'm like, okay, that sucks. And that would be very hard, especially when you're wearing armor, just from a kind of logical sense. Like, okay, I swung with a scimitar and I hit my knee and suddenly I severed the bottom of my leg. Well, you know, he goes, okay, well, roll damage against yourself. And I go, well, all right. And I was a first level character. I had like 5 hit points because I had no constitution. So I roll my dice and I roll 2d6 and I roll 2 6s. So that was pretty awful. And I remember I only had a couple hit points left. And so I roll 2 6s, I cut my leg off, my constitution sucks, and so my character dies. So I'm like, I spent all this time making this character and then my character dies like first encounter because of something that was DM ego. The second thing, I like to call it railroading. A railroad only goes in one direction, right? You cannot stray from off that railroad. I like to use this analogy because when you're a game master, you don't want to be railroading your players into going down a single line of thinking. I can play a video game and do that. I can go play something like Dragon Age if I want to be railroaded. And even in Dragon Age, I can kind of go different directions, which is pretty cool. But you know, I can play a lot of different games that are very one-dimensional. The cool thing about tabletop role-playing is the imagination and the other places you can go with it. Okay, so we went around the encounter as players. As a GM, you get all this opportunity to figure out how that story is going to unfold. And you have to remember that the story is not just your story. You're giving the framework, but the players are also telling the story. It's actually a two-way street. And a lot of GMs, this kind of goes back to ego, they have a hard time understanding that the players tell the story as much as the GM tells the story. And this is super critical to understand this. So once you understand this part of it, you can get away from that habit of forcing your players down one line. Game master player characters. If you're a game master or you have a game master who's doing this, you you're a game master. You play all the other characters. Stop trying to role play with a group. If you want to have a character that you role play, be a player. Don't be a game master. And be honest about that, because that derails everything. Because what happens? The players don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what the dungeon is going to look like. They don't know the motivations of the enemy. However, as the game master, your character that you're playing does know all of this. And it's almost impossible to separate that and not metagame, because that player that is controlled by the game master will always know more than the player characters. And that sucks, because you lose agency, because you're at a disadvantage the whole time. Your game master's character will sit there and upstage them. And, your game master is there to play support for you. You have to think, as a game master, you're actually in a supporting role. The ones who are in the spotlight are those people across the table from you. All of your characters, your NPCs, non-player characters, they need to be sitting there supporting them. They cannot steal the spotlight. The villains can, and that's really fun, but don't play a character. That just sucks. Number 4, boring robotic encounters. Combat doesn't have to suck. Combat can be really fun. You can fight up and down stairs, fight on balconies, fight across different levels. Even especially in sci-fi settings too, you can have people with jetpacks. You can have people with firearms far away. In fantasy settings, you can have floating islands of rock. You can have magic going crazy. You can fight across dimensions. You have the whole universe to play with. You don't have to make encounters one-dimensional. And even if you have a low-level encounter, there are still fun things you can do in that encounter. Let's say you have a fighter who didn't have enough money for a ranged weapon, so he's just got his shield up tanking shots from an ranged encounter. Well, one of the things you can do is think about the encounter. If you have a ranged encounter, let's say you have orcs with javelins. Well, they're raining javelins down at you. Well, guess what? There's plenty of javelins lying around that a fighter can pick up and chuck that at the enemy. And that's a cool way to do it. Having multiple avenues of attack. Fights aren't just open a door and then walk in and there's bad guys there, and then everything behind you is cool. Fights happen from multiple angles. You can have a fight in a town or a graveyard, have shopkeepers, put civilians there. Fights break out all over the place. Bar fights are fantastic in games to start off games if you want to play with the combat mechanics, because there are bystanders there. There are people who would just jump in who are on neither side. They are not the aggressors, but they're trying to stop the fight, for instance. So you got to deal with those people. There could be an NPC interfering with you while you're fighting some other person in a bar fight. Put in other stuff. Having chairs, having crates, having flaming things. These are all sorts of fun stuff. Even, and talking about fire, you're in a building. Okay, the villain lights it on fire. You have to make combat entertaining. And I'll have another video on that you can check out. But entertaining combat, that helps. Boring one-dimensional, you do this, then you do this. It's not as fun. So make sure you're livening up combat with fun elements in there, and not just going from person to person robotically hacking and slashing. Number 5, one-dimensional NPCs. If I wanted one-dimensional NPCs, I would go play Skyrim or something like that. They're one-dimensional. They only have a set amount of answers programmed into them. Knights of the Old Republic, these Dragon Age, these sorts of games. There's 5 or 10 answers that are programmed into the NPC. They can't think for themselves. Well, the thing you got to remember is NPCs are living, breathing, thinking people. And I've had so many times in gaming where I will have a peasant farmer, like a fish farmer, or a fish seller. They talk to this guy. He ends up, they want to know more about this. There's something that catches a PC's attention. A dwarven merchant, for instance, is selling some wares. He's selling some really nice leather armor. Well, where'd that armor come from? They see it's got Elven script in it. Well, you have a dwarven merchant selling armor with Elven script in it? Like, what is this? That's the kind of thing that a PC will latch onto, and they'll be like, a player will be like, I really am intrigued by this, especially if they're playing an elf or a dwarf. And there's been some animosity between elves and dwarves in the area. Well, there's those differences in gaming, and they want to understand more. Why is a dwarf selling elven armor? They want to understand. Maybe, they follow him back to where he's getting this armor from, and along the way, the dwarf stops and he sets down, a flower at an elven grave, and you're like, what is happening here? If you have other pet peeves about Game Masters and things that you dislike about it, or just funny things that you think that Game Masters can improve upon, drop those in the comments. I would love to hear more about it. And I'll see you next time.